contemporanei, e è autore, fra le varie cose, oltre che di una importante introduzione a Heidegger, che è capitato anche a me di leggere con profitto, per inciso il professor Figal attualmente ricopre la cattedra che fu di Heidegger e di Husserl di Friburgo. Ha scritto anche un gigantesco libro sulla oggettualità e sull'importanza dell'oggetto all'interno della fenomenologia e dell'ermeneutica, che costituisce una svolta importante rispetto a dei possibili esiti molto soggettivistici che l'ermeneutica aveva preso nel secolo scorso. Tra l'altro esce nel 2006, che può essere considerato un annus mirabilis per il realismo, perché è lo stesso anno in cui esce, dopo la finitudine di Mediasù, Paura di conoscere di Bogossian, poi c'è il libro del 2005 veramente, ma comunque di Graham Harman sugli oggetti, e anche lì la riflessione sugli oggetti partiva da Heidegger, come abbiamo visto, la riflessione in essere e tempo. Ha scritto anche moltissimo sull'estetica. Questo è un suo libro, Estetica come fenomenologia, l'apparenza delle cose, che è uscito in tedesco nel 2010 e che adesso è stato appena tradotto in inglese proprio in questi giorni. Io qui mi fermo, non sto a raccontare altre cose sull'importanza degli oggetti in quel di Freiburg, a partire dalla teoria dell'oggetto, l'oggetto della conoscenza di Rickert nel 1904 mi sembra, e poi vari altri scritti si sono susseguiti sempre a parlare di oggetti, e do senza tempo in mezzo la parola al professor Günter.
Let me start by excusing myself for speaking in English. I would much more have preferred to speak in Italian, but in this case my paper would have to be translated, and so it was a little bit more comfortable for me to write it directly. And then let me continue my introductory remarks by expressing my gratitude to Professor Ferraris for inviting me for this lecture. It has been a great pleasure for me to look forward to this day, and I have come to Torino, which is such a lively center for contemporary philosophy, with great pleasure and eager to learn something about what you are doing here. My paper will have two parts actually, namely a first part which is more or less critical discussion of traditional phenomenology, of classical phenomenology, and more concretely mainly of Husserl. And in the second part I will try to make some suggestions how to solve the problems which in my opinion are closely connected to Husserl's conception of phenomenology. These suggestions are extracts in some way from a book of mine which will be published soon in April or May this year in German, and the title in English would be Inconspicuousness, the Space of Phenomenology. So my suggestions in the second part of the paper have closely to do something with the conception of space, and I will try to make plausible why I think that the theme of space is crucial for a systematic systematic constitution of phenomenology. The title has changed a little bit. The title of the paper is there something really outside? And the subtitle, An Outline of Realistic Phenomenology. Phenomenology is not just famous or notorious for being realistic. In order to argue for philosophical realism, it has rather often been regarded as a counterpart. Quentin Meillassoux has most rigidly maintained this position. As Meillassoux argues, the phenomenological conviction that entities have to be understood in correlation with the modes of referring to them is subjectivistic. So this basic concept of correlation, which is basic for phenomenology, is regarded as to be subjectivistic. According to Meillassoux, entities understood in a phenomenological way are nothing but the correlates of representational reference, perceptual or conceptual and possibly linguistic, accessible only as dyed or colored by the modes of reference. Reality then would be only subjective reality, enclosed and hidden in subjective representations of whatsoever kind, and thus no real reality. It would not be something really exterior, namely something beyond representation. It is not very difficult to find evidence for Meillassoux' suspicion concerning the subjectivistic character of the phenomenological conception of correlation. It is the founder of modern phenomenology, Husserl himself, who characterizes this correlation as subjective. He does so in one of the very few passages in his work which determine phenomena as such. A determination Jean-Luc Marion has called canonic. As Husserl says, the word phenomenon is ambivalent in virtue of the essential correlation between appearing and something that appears. Though, as Husserl continues, the Greek word phenomenon literally means that which appears. In German it would be das Erscheinende. The word is preferably used for appearing itself. The subjective phenomenon, if, as Husserl adds, this expression may be allowed, though it can be roughly be misunderstood in a psychological way. This characterization, which is to be found in a lecture course held in 1907, is really canonic. It anticipates Husserl's position as articulated in Ideas 1, published in 1913, according to which phenomena have to be understood as belonging to the immanent being of pure consciousness, which, as Husserl states, quoting Descartes, does not need anything else to exist. By this, to be sure, Husserl does not determine phenomena as mental presentations, which have nothing to do with reality. Phenomena, according to Husserl, are not to be reduced to mental events which can be described psychologically. Rather, at least if they are no imaginations or dreams, they are the immanent appearing of something real, and thereby, to use Husserl's vocabulary, in their immanence transcendent. Transcendent in Husserl's use of this term means exterior. As Husserl stresses in the Cartesian Meditations, transcendence in every form is an immanent character of being that constitutes itself inside of the ego. So that sounds rather paradoxical and needs badly interpretation. Transcendence is a character of the immanence that is not at all on the first glance very clear what that shall mean. Thus, to conclude, for Husserl, the reality of the transcendent indeed is subjective reality in Meyersu's sense. But as I think, one should not follow Meyersu's objections all too quickly, since Husserl's considerations as sketched are plausible, at least in one respect. Reality as transcendence is only relevant insofar as it is experienced. And this experience may also be called, as Husserl calls it, namely constitution. In order to know what reality is, reality in its sense must be presented in or for its experience. But, and as this Meyersu's argument is really to the point, it is problematic to reduce transcendence to its subjective sense, and thus to something immanent. This is the paradox I just have sketched. Immanent transcendence, and in this point I follow Meyersu, immanent transcendence is no transcendence at all. And the same holds true for reality, if reality as such is transcendent, as Husserl would say. This, however, does not mean that the philosophical consequence Meyersu draws from this result is in every respect convincing. Even if one agrees that the notions of immanent transcendence and subjective reality are problematic, one may doubt whether the idea of a grand exterior, un grand dehors, a real reality, as Meyersu introduced it, does make sense. How to conceive something externally real without any subjective correlate, or to say it with Husserl's term, without any mode of subjective appearing. Meyersu's examples, like the origin of the universe or the formation of the earth, are indeed of such a kind that they withdraw from experience and thus from the essential correlation between appearing and something that appears. But just because of this, they do not appear immediately. But just because they do not appear immediately to anyone, they can only be present in representations. So my point, my critical point against Meyersu is that what Meyersu takes to be real reality, really exterior reality, is even more dyed by representations as reality conceived in the phenomenological way. Because something like the origin of the earth or the origin of the universe cannot be experienced immediately in any way. And because it cannot be experienced in any way, it can be present only indirectly and mostly in different ways to speak about it. So only representationally, for instance in theoretical physics or in myths about the origin of the universe or so. If this is correct, if this objection is correct, then the phenomenological approach to reality proves to be still or even in a new way attractive. Reality, as it seems, is best to be understood philosophically in considering the correlation between reference and what is referred to. But in order to do justice to reality as such, one should not simply follow Husserl's version of this correlation as given in the canonic determination of phenomena. Reality must not be regarded as immanent reality. Rather, and this is my point, its transcendent character, its exteriority, must seriously be taken into account. Husserl himself has made some preparatory steps into this direction. So when he says in Ideas 1 that the world as reality is always there, that means also if it is considered in the immanence of pure consciousness. In phenomenological examination, reality is not denied, not even doubted, but only bracketed. That means it is no longer regarded as something familiar, self-evident, and thus also no longer as object of practical or scientific interest. This bracketing of reality, tantamount to what Husserl calls epoche, is not even a reduction of the transcendence reality into subjective and thus immanent appearing. Already in his 1907 lecture course, and despite his canonical determination of phenomena, Husserl discovers what puzzles him a lot, namely that acts of consciousness hold all kinds of transcendences. As an example, which I would like to take up to make this more concrete, Husserl mentions the difference between a sound and its experience in hearing. According to this consideration, the acoustic experience of a sound is different from the sound itself. First, because in experience only a part of the sound is present, namely the part which is actually heard, whereas the sound as such is tantamount to the whole duration of sounding. Acoustic experience and the sound which is heard are also different in the second aspect, namely because acoustic experience also holds present what is no longer really present, namely the sound insofar as it has already bygone, or in Husserl's vocabulary, as its retentions. As one may add, acoustic experience is also determined by the experiencing person's attentiveness, her or his dispositions, associations, and competence of understanding. Thus, the sound as such, or as one may also say, the real sound, is really different from its experience. Experience, the subjective appearing of something like a sound, is not possible and not intelligible as what it is without this difference. So my point is, we need a realistic conception of what can be experienced in order to understand experience at all. And we have at least some initial considerations of Husserl's which lead us into this direction. Husserl, to sum up, sees the difference between experience as such and what is experience very clearly. And accordingly, he has elaborated it very carefully, and in Ideas 1, fixed it terminologically as the difference between noesis and noema. He nevertheless, and as I would say unfortunately, maintains his conviction articulated in the 1907 lecture course that the difference between experience and what is experienced belongs to the sphere of pure givenness and thus to true immanence. The reason why does he this? The reason why, I think, is not grounded, as one could suspect, in some dubious Cartesian dogmatism. Rather, this reason can be explained by the canonic determination of phenomena, more precisely by Husserl's conviction that only this determination can work as a fundament for phenomenology. According to Husserl, phenomena must be subjective appearing because only as such they can be understood as different from reality as it is experienced in the natural, non-phenomenological attitude. Only in subjective appearing something can be experienced not straight as something one is in whatsoever way interested in, but in reflection, which, according to Husserl, is tantamount to phenomenological cognition and thus enables phenomenological description. So it is the point that Husserl tries to found or ground phenomenology in reflection, and he can think of reflection only as of a kind of immanent cognition in whatsoever consciousness. As to reflection, Husserl's argument should be plausible. Only as distinguished from practical or scientific experience, phenomenology can claim its specific explanatory approach to the world and its experience. And furthermore, it has a lot to commend that the explanatory approach is essentially reflective. Even in non-philosophical and thereby non-phenomenological contexts, insight in the specific status of something experienced and of experience itself is gained reflectively. In reflection, one does not simply experience something, but rather makes attempts to elucidate how it allows experience and how its experience can be. This, however, and this is a critical point against Husserl, this, however, does not mean that in reflection one turns away from reality and concentrates on its subjective or immanent appearing. Reflection is no metacognition of cognitions, but rather a specific change in cognition itself. Reflecting, for instance, one's own attempts to accomplish something does not transform these attempts to meta-correlates of cognition, but considers these attempts as different options in relation to different modes and aspects of what is to be accomplished. Reflection, to sum up, reflection as I would like to understand this, is consideration of the possible. Reflection is consideration of the possible. It is devoted to what can be done and to what can be in such a way that what is done and what actually is also is regarded as possible in the context of possibilities. This can easily be applied to phenomenological reflection. And since phenomenology is essentially reflective, to phenomenology as such. Based on Husserl's canonic determination of phenomena, phenomenology can be understood as reflection on the correlation between appearing and what appears, and thus to both aspects in the correlation in their mutual possibility. But in contrast to Husserl's version, this correlation should no longer be reduced to subjective or immanent appearing. It should be taken as essentially transcendent and thus as true correlation, in which subjective appearing is as essential as what really appears. The peculiar task of phenomenology, then, is to reflect this true correlation. One may also call it the phenomenal correlation in its essential transcendence. Along with this, transcendent reality, real reality, is a genuine phenomenological theme. But phenomenologically, it is not just reality as it is for the natural, self-evident ways of reference. Rather, it is reality reflected in its transcendence, more precisely in the possibility of transcendence. So, to sum up my point, I would suggest to understand phenomenological reflection, and phenomenology essentially is reflection, as reflection of the transcendence which is essential for the correlation between experience and what is to be experienced, or what can be experienced, or what is experienced. But how is the reflection of transcendence, as it has proved to be the essential task of phenomenology, to be achieved? One can infer the basic answer to this question from the term transcendence as used by Husserl himself. Transcendence, I just alluded to this, transcendence in Husserl's sense is equivalent to exteriority. And exteriority is clearly a spatial term. Phenomenology then is essentially reflection of space. Space, accordingly, is no particular subject matter of phenomenological reflection. It rather enables phenomenological reflection, since the correlation between experience and what is experienced, between noesis and noema, is as such spatial. Phenomenology then is spatial reflection, and as such it can and must also be reflection of space. What this can mean may first be illustrated in taking up Husserl's example, namely the experience of sound. Sounds are only heard when they really affect the ear. Without affection, they could not be heard, but only imagined. But to imagine something as a true sound is most likely not possible without having before made acoustic experience. In order to be experienced, however, sounds must be somewhere and come from somewhere, thus being exterior to the sense they affect. Also, they must be allowed to be sounds by certain conditions of sounding. With sounds, one also experiences the room in which they sound, and which is free space for their sounding. Following Husserl's description, however, one may take sounds not primarily as spatial, but as temporal. Sounds have a particular duration, and they have phases which can be distinguished as following one another. They are, with one word, successive, and in their successiveness they come and pass by, so that only one phase of them can be actually heard. The phases not actually heard must be expected as well as kept in mind in order to have a succession of sounding. Of course, the spatial character of sounds as sketched cannot be seriously doubted. The temporal character of sounds as sketched cannot be seriously doubted. But it cannot be understood in contrast to spatiality, as if time and space could be regarded as alternative. Yet furthermore, the spatial and the temporal character of sounds are not equal, as if they were independent from each other and just two different conditions for the possibility of sounds. In order to last for some measurable time, sounds must primarily be somewhere, and free space must allow their sounding. This actual sounding, to stress this point once more, is not subjective but real. Other listeners can also experience it. The same holds true for the distinction of different phases in the temporal succession of sounds, which, understood in this way, is a real succession. Its reality, however, is not primarily temporal, but primarily spatial. The distinction of different phases of a sound is only possible because these phases are exterior to each other. Their exteriority is not essentially different from that of stepping stones in a Japanese garden. The only difference is that the stepping stones are just there, waiting, as it were, to be stepped on successively, whereas the phases of a sound are there only in the moment of actual sounding. But if a sound would only have two different phases, for instance a higher and a lower phase, which would alternate successively, succession would soon cease to dominate the experience of the sound, and the exteriority, that means the spatiality of the phases, would prevail. What holds true for sounds more obviously is the case with visible and touchable objects and with buildings. Their spatial character is beyond doubt, and so is the spatial character of their experience. With objects and buildings, the difference between the two correlates easily is intelligible as difference in and of space. To illustrate this, a building may be the best example. In order to experience a building, one has to discover it from farther and closer by, from different sides, from outside and inside. Dependent on the perspective of experience, a building appears differently. But these different possibilities of appearances are those of the building. The building really has these different possibilities of appearance. Once more, it really has these different possibilities of appearance. They can be noumetically determined. Or to put it in a slightly different way, the building offers these possibilities to those who experience it, and if someone realizes some of these possibilities, the building appears in her or his experience. This experience could be otherwise, and it will never realize all possibilities of appearance as subjective appearing. It will also be dyed by the experiencing person's dispositions, competences, and preferences. The building itself, however, is not dyed in this way. Other persons with other noetic dispositions, competences, and preferences will experience it differently. And nevertheless, they would easily agree that one has experienced the same building. So there is really a building that we can experience differently. And we can easily agree normally about the character of this building, about how many rooms it has, how many corridors, whether the rooms are bright or are dark, and so on. So in this agreement, the building itself, as it were, comes to the fore. These considerations may implicitly have answered the questions how correlates of noetically determined experience are to be understood in their transcendent reality. This reality is not just a matter of fact. It cannot simply be stated in propositions. Rather, transcendent reality is that of a set of possibilities, some of which are actual because they are actualized in experience, whereas many, often innumerably many of them, remain latent, like for instance the sides of a building not actually seen. But as possibilities, they are nevertheless real. They really are possibilities, for instance, of a particular building which cannot be reduced to its experience, just like the rules of a game cannot be reduced to the experience of the players. Only secondarily they are possibilities of subjective appearing, because subjective appearing is dependent on them, like moves in a game are dependent on the game's rules. Only because, for instance, a building is accessible in a certain way, it can be experienced in this particular accessibility. Or, to speak phenomenologically, something like a building can only appear subjectively in a certain way because it shows itself just in such a way that it basically determines subjective appearing. Subjective appearing, however, is not determined in every respect. It may be restricted by short-sightedness. It may fall short, for instance, of the architectural subtlety of a building, and it may also be dyed by presuppositions and prejudices of whatsoever kind. But insofar as subjective appearing is an experience of something, it is its correlate that enables this particular experience. This enabling just mentioned deserves and even needs further consideration. How can experience be determined by its correlate? How do the two components of phenomenal correlations, noesis and noema, fit together? In order to answer these questions, the example of a building may again be helpful. The experience of a building is essentially tantamount to experiencing its spatial structure. Big bright rooms with large windows and high ceilings cannot be experienced as dark and narrow. A building with many rooms and long corridors needs more experiential effort than a cabin with only one room. It is more difficult to orient oneself in a labyrinth-like building than in a building the structure of which can be realized on the first glance. What is experienced in every mentioned case is the space of the building. Buildings are built space, and this also means space to be experienced with the building in its materiality, its openness or closeness, its brightness or darkness. Such experience of space is itself spatial. Experiencing a room, a person is subject to the room's spatial conditions, and this is only possible because the person, as a bodily living being, is spatially determined in particular ways. Standing upright, being able to turn her or his head, to stretch her or his arms, and to walk, to look around and up and down, every person is essentially disposed for certain spatial determinations. These determinations are mostly not rigid, but allow a set of different activities and passivities. They are determinations in and of free space, which allow experiential freedom. So, to sum up, it is space, for instance the space of a building, to which the building's enabling of experience and thus its reality can be traced back. Since also objects and living beings are spatial, they also enable their respective experience. With buildings, however, the enabling character of space should be more obvious than with objects and living beings. Though buildings can be looked at like objects, extraordinary big objects, admittedly, they essentially do not appear as objects. It is not their objectivity which lets them be buildings, but rather their surrounding and even enclosing character. Objects and living beings are spatial, but buildings, this is worth to be repeated, are built space. Though they do have noematic aspects as space, they cannot be reduced to them. Rather, they allow the enabling character of space as such to appear. Buildings encompass living beings, among them persons, and objects or things, and accordingly, they cannot be experienced like anything else with nomadic character. Their experience includes, at least to some degree, the very possibility of experience and of that which is and can be experienced. Thus, with buildings, it is evident that the two sides of the phenomenal correlation, noesis and noema, are spatially and in space belong together. The correlation as such is space, or more precisely, space can be this correlation. In this case, however, space can be called the enabling of phenomenality. Phenomenality, taken as the interplay of noesis and noema, is as such spatial. Especially with the example of buildings, this may have become plausible, at least I hope so. The question, however, may have emerged how space as such can be conceived, and how subsequently the phenomenal status of space, as well as its status for phenomenality and phenomenology can be described more concretely. To answer these questions is a task not easily and briefly to be solved. A sufficient answer requires an extensive investigation of how one conceptually can determine what is generally called space, mostly without realizing that space is original no term for space in general. Further considerations can elucidate that what in English is called space, in a general sense, is referred to in manifold ways. Accordingly, philosophers who discuss time, from Aristotle to Heidegger, basically speak about the same, whereas the discussion of what may be called space is remarkably different. The passage on Chora in Plato's Timaeus is not about the same as the passages on topos, place, in Aristotle's physics. Void, emptiness, is crucial for Democritus as well as for Laozi, whereas Descartes, like Aristotle, tries to show that the concept of void does not make sense. For Descartes and also for Husserl, what is called space is essentially extension. If one also takes into account the various aspects of distance, spatial orders of orientation, and so on, one can easily conclude that what is called space is rather complex. For the time being, however, it may, and it must be sufficient, to refer once more to the three characters of what is called space that I have already introduced in the discussion of sounds. Sounds, to recall this, must be somewhere. They must have a place, like everything that takes place. Furthermore, their sounding must be enabled. They need free space for their appearance. And in order to be there as sounds, finally, they must be different from the sense they affect, and they must also be apart from each other. They can only be what they are in exteriority. So, place, free space, and exteriority are spatial characters which prove to be indispensable for the description of sounds as appearances. The same holds true for the description of acoustic experience. Such experience is made at a certain place, dependent from which the sound experienced is distanced or nearby, hardly to hear or loud, and overwhelming. Acoustic experience must be enabled by free space in acoustically appropriate rooms which allow it. And as already mentioned, acoustic experience must be external to the sound experienced and so itself be in exteriority. These characterizations may be generalized in such a way that they are applied to the phenomenal correlation as such. What is called correlation then proves to be determined by the spatial characters of place, free space, and exteriority. These characters provide with a phenomenological concretion of what formerly is noetic appearing as well as noematic appearance. Appearing and appearances are not possible except as spatially enabled in the way just characterized. Even if this may sound convincing, one may ask how the spatial enabling of phenomenology can be described more concretely, or as one would also say, more phenomenologically. Such a description can only be given if space as such is essentially related to phenomenality and not just a condition among others for phenomena to be there without having as such a space phenomenal sense. Taking up the spatial characters introduced, one can quite easily show that this is indeed the case. Place, free space, and exteriority are, each of them in a specific way, inconspicuous. Mostly, one does not pay attention to the place of something, but rather to that which is at a place. Likewise, one does not experience the free space of something exterior, but something in its free space and also in its exteriority. Space in whatever character then is not experienced directly, but rather experienced with something spatial. Something spatial, in turn, is experienced as appearance, with space in its inconspicuousness. So the interspace between two objects is experienced with the objects, which appear as particular objects only with the space between them. The phenomenal, then, as the interplay between appearing and appearance, essentially goes along with the inconspicuous. Phenomenology is phenomenology of the inconspicuous in the double sense that in describing phenomena, it has to do with the inconspicuous and is itself enabled by it. To conclude, one may briefly take up again the theme of reality. As has been shown, reality does not, as a character of being, belong to the immanence of pure consciousness, as Husserl thinks. And reality is not outside the consciousness, which correspondingly would be inside. There is no mental inside. Reference to something outside is, as such, outside. So reality is outside, exterior without contrast. Reality is spatial and not only in space. Thank you very much for your attention.